While my next MCU review plods stubbornly on, I thought I'd tide you over with something in the meantime. Only instead of covering something I fundamentally despise, this time I thought I'd put one of my favourites to the test, The Cabin in the Woods. Now, as one of my favourites, I absolutely recommend this film for its novel concept, its efficient script, and its excellent performances. But if, like me, you started this review expecting an objective, fire-breathing, 24-carat 10 out of 10, well, even with my final score in mind, I wouldn't blame anyone for that. The following is a full spoiler analysis, and I will be discussing the plot chronologically and in detail. If you just want to go into the film blind, fair enough, we'll see you afterward. But equally, this analysis may be what makes you decide to watch it for yourself, so I'll leave that entirely up to you. Regardless, I should say that if you see Cabin in the Woods advertised and go to bypass it because it looks generic, please know that this is purposeful and central to the wider point of the film. Anyway, spoiler-free segment over. If you don't want to know events of the plot in detail, turn back now. But if you're already familiar with Cabin and you just want to skip past all the praise to where my criticisms begin, you can head to this timecode. Right off the bat, the opening credits seem entirely like something we've seen a million times before. Ooh, a trail of blood, puddling into generic images of ritual sacrifice across multiple cultures. Yawn. Blood is so yesterday, Grandpa. Maybe if it was a trail of pus suddenly you had a bit of hair on your chest. But, for viewers going in blind, I suspect this generic feeling is entirely by design, and is intended to pass for humdrum horror imagery without provoking a second thought. But why would that be the film's intent? Anyway, we snap away from that and suddenly find ourselves in a typical office canteen, where two office guys, Steve Hadley and Gary Citizen, are having a conversation at a coffee vending machine, with dialogue that instantly grounds them as real people. Citizen comments briefly here and there, but mostly listens as Hadley bitches about his wife and his belief that she's jinxing her recent fertility treatment by installing child locks all over their house. But who the fuck are these guys, I hear you cry? Where are the 30-year-old teenagers? Where are the lumpy-faced inbred psychopaths? Well, you better strap yourself in, silly bollocks, because unlike those lame slasher movies you like, here we've actually got some characters to establish. Even this early on, the dialogue allows us to infer that Hadley's prone to superstition, which is subtle and commonplace enough to be completely innocuous on a first watch, but which will be appreciated by repeat viewers as a clever little piece of foreshadowing for what this setting is revealed to be later on. Anyway, their casual conversation is interrupted by a chem scientist named Lynn, who worriedly informs them that the Stockholm branch have failed, and since she doesn't need to elaborate further to Hadley or Citizen, indicating this is work-related, her concerned tone allows us to infer that Stockholm's failure represents a significant setback for their entire organisation. But Hadley and Citizen both meet her concern with a general air of, quickly identifying them as the more experienced employees, and they both agree that if all else fails, Japan's 100% success rate means they likely have nothing to worry about. But what's the purpose of naming Stockholm and Japan here, in a script-writing sense? Well, it's to indicate to us that these characters are part of a global organisation, with the dialogue indicating that it's one designed to fulfil some kind of shared central goal. And even though we don't have a lot to go on right now, knowing this organisation has a worldwide presence allows us to infer that this shared goal, whatever it is of high importance, but only requires one branch to accomplish it to be successful. And it's worth noting that none of this information was outwardly stated, but the dialogue and performances gave us enough context clues to let us intuitively understand a little of what's happening here, even if you weren't consciously thinking about it. Anyway, clearly now bored of Lynn, Hadley makes a snide comment about a previous failure caused by her chem department some years ago, and he and Citizen brusquely drive off, leaving Lynn behind to catch up with them on foot, showing these two to be absolute bastards. I mean, very confident, sarcastic, and quite arrogant, with the blasé nature of people who are comfortable in jobs they have a proven track record within. The scene ends with a very jarring reintroduction of the title, complete with cheesy-ass stock scream sound, just to reassure you that, yes, that was weird, wasn't it? But against all odds, you didn't actually download the wrong film this time, you idiot. And there we go. One scene, and for what little information we have about how this organisation works, enough has been conveyed for us to already have a sense of the basics, as well as Hadley and Citizen's characters and dynamic, not only to each other, but to the rest of the organisation as well. There's a word to describe this kind of writing, and that word is efficient. Or maybe it's expeditious. Or maybe it's both, but who looks up definitions anymore? Like, literally. Anyway, we've got some classic horror team protagonists to introduce before their imminent grisly demises, starting with Dana, who, despite having a bedroom window that faces the entire suburb, has elected to pack a suitcase without wearing any trousers for some reason. Seeming to be blissfully unaware that her knickers are on display for all to see, Dana slowly opens a sketchbook where she sketched a man's face from the side, implying this picture was drawn in secret, and, clearly crushing hard on this man, lingers on the picture for a little bit, her heart all aflutter. before being interrupted by her also doubtlessly soon-to-be murdered friend, Jules, who looks over Dana's shoulder and asks why she hasn't put the picture of that piece of shit on the dartboard yet, instantly trying to snag our interest early on by dangling some implied questions for us to demand to know the answer to. Who is this? Why does Jules think he's a piece of shit? Why has Dana drawn him in her sketchbook if that's the case, etc.? Dana, turning to look at her, is surprised to see that Jules has recently dyed her hair blonde, and is rightfully in dismay that her friend is committed to having the objectively worst hair colour on purpose. Dana is surprised that Jules has recently dyed her hair blonde, and Jules asks what she thinks, quickly becoming insecure when Dana doesn't answer immediately, indicating that such a drastic colour change is unusual for her. But why could I be bringing that up? Anyway, Dana manages to assure Jules that she does like her as a blonde, and Jules, now free of her brief anxiety about her appearance, rips the picture out of the book and announces her plans to burn it. And as Dana protests and says that it isn't his fault, Jules loudly expresses her distaste for a teacher who fucked his student, then dumped her over email. Ah! Kill the exposition with fire! But actually no, this is fine, because now we have more information on the nature of this relationship, Dana's objection to sketch-related violence, especially as the victim, who's apparently in denial about having been taken advantage of, would absolutely indicate to Jules that she needs a little reminding of the reality of the situation. Thus, exposition has been delivered to the audience, but rather than just being said purely for our benefit, it's said in a context where a character believes they have a legitimate reason to remind another character of it. It's, and I will be overusing this word, organic. But also, consider the last few minutes, which establish that Dana has an innocent crush on someone, then, with just a little dialogue, recontextualise that situation into a far more morally dubious issue. Who initiated this teacher-student relationship? What caused it to end? Was it an affair? Would Dana continue with him if she had the option? The film doesn't answer any of these things because none of it needs to be answered, but already the script is wasting no time in initiating a pattern of things appearing one way on the surface and being something else underneath. Jules, eager to change the subject from Dana's teacher, tries to amp her up about her imminent introduction to someone her own age, Holden. But Dana, having developed a taste for meat of the grey and saggy variety, Dana, understandably feeling a little bit emotionally fragile right now, isn't too jazzed about being pressured into taking a bikini on the trip, saying that she won't have any fun if Jules and Kurt, her boyfriend, ship her and Holden too hard. Jules promises not to, but, obviously invested in Dana moving on, packs the bikini anyway, then questions why Dana has multiple textbooks packed. Dana says she'll need them in case she gets bored, and Jules asks how they'll help, indicating to us that of the two, Dana is the Velma and Jules is the Daphne who thinks that learning stuff is gay. But suddenly Kurt enters the room, and in a show of raw animal machismo, throws an American football out of Dana's window and across the street, which is then successfully caught by Holden, whose considerable catching prowess seems to far outweigh his spatial awareness of oncoming traffic. As Holden apologises to the driver who almost hit him, his pained expression could perhaps indicate that footing the bill after getting talked into dumbassery like this is a regular occurrence for him. Or maybe I'm being overly charitable here, I don't know. Anyway, back in the room, Kurt amuses Jules by flirtatiously commenting on her newly blonde hair, but then, after noticing Dana's textbooks, seems to become angry, demanding to know where Jules got them and who told her about them. Jules yells that she learned it from watching him, and dramatically storms off, and Kurt laughs, revealing this to be a witty joke between them, not just showcasing their natural chemistry, but also continuing this pattern of appearances being deceptive. Since now we've had this joke, we can see that Jules isn't quite the airhead we might have pegged her as being just a few dialogue exchanges ago. But surprises abound, because the same happens with Kurt, who looks at Dana's textbooks and says they'll be covered in her lectures, recommending that she read different ones to make her seem more insightful. With this, we see that Kurt, despite his appearance as a Hemsworthian meathead jock archetype, is in actual fact also a sociology graduate, and luckily for my Victorian-era sense of modesty, he finally points out to Dana that she's not wearing any trousers. Cutting slightly later, Kurt is loading up the caravan, and makes a joke about how much Jules is packing, but she replies that she isn't bringing anything he won't be glad she brought. Kurt smirks and says he's going to shut his mouth, and it's really worth noting that this flirtation is reasonably subtle, self-contained, and discreet, which I may or not be mentioning for a reason, but spoiler alert, I am. Not so subtle, self-contained, or discreet is the entrance of our fifth and final teen destined for horrible disembowelment, Marty, who arrives driving while smoking a bong the size of your mum's favourite didgeridoo, his car slowly rolling to a halt as his open windows belch marijuana smoke. Jules and Kurt stop what they're doing to reprimand him, asking if he's trying to get arrested, since they'd rather go on the trip to Kurt's cousin's country house. But Marty, high as a kite, says that the police would never arrest a man with a huge bong in his car, because they fear this man, for he sees farther than they. Then asks if Jules' hair has gone grey, achieving 2 jokes in one by humorously undercutting his previous statement and disrupting the rule of 3. I love this script. Kurt says that Marty isn't bringing a bong that big into his father's caravan, and Marty, asking if Kurt is stoned or something, smiles sardonically and reveals that the bong compresses to look like a travel mug, establishing that, unlike your average stoner, Marty's actually not a boring loser. I mean, Marty's actually in possession of a certain wry cleverness, which is probably more insulting to say, actually. But voila, 4 out of 5 of our protagonists are established fairly well, especially considering we're only 3 scenes in, which is probably attributable to how these characters, despite their appearances, have been quickly established to be so at odds with the stereotypes we'd be tempted to assign to them. Anyway, with the caravan loaded up with teens, luggage and Kurt's dirt bike, the gang embark. But we linger a while to pan up to the roof, where we see the neighbourhood Google agent going about his day-to-day and reporting the teens' departure to someone back at HQ. Although the musical cue seems to treat that as odd for some reason. Verdamtisch. In the caravan, Marty espouses to the others about how excited he is to get off the grid, away from the binding nature of society. Dialogue which may seem stilted if it was coming from anyone but the team pothead. Marty speaks derisively about how sterilised society has become, saying that it deserves to crumble, but we're all just too chicken shit to let it. Jules says she's missed Marty's rants, indicating that these two have been friends a long time, which is worth remembering, and Marty, rolling a fresh joint, promises they will all soon come round to his way of thinking. And you may wonder why I'm laying this all out so early on, but the nice thing with this script is that every line is doing something important, whether we're building character, the world, or foreshadowing stuff to come. For example, Marty's dialogue, as repeat viewers will well know, foreshadows the central philosophy of the film, introducing it completely organically yet again, by having it said through a character who clearly enjoys ranting about society's shortcomings in ways unapparent to those who don't partake in psychoactive drugs. The gang pull up to a petrol station from the late Jurassic era, looking to refuel, but, hopeless millennials that they are unable to work out how to use the pump or how to pay. Marty jokes about the place being so old they may have to barter for the gas, and Kurt smiles in amusement, in a very brisk and organic display of their friendship, which again, sounds trivial, but you'd be surprised how many on-screen friends never get to demonstrate why they like each other, despite the fact it's a really efficient way to flesh out multiple characters at once. Anyway, Holden pokes around inside the station and is suddenly confronted by the old grizzled owner, who seems entirely hostile to the concept of exchanging money for goods and services. Which is odd, considering that you'd think that someone with such a remote business would be eager for customers. The owner intimidates Holden into retreating outside, but Kurt, trying to keep the exchange civil, says they've just come to buy gas, with Holden and Jules adding that they need directions to the cabin on Tillerman Road. An interesting note, to me anyway. A Tillerman is one who uses a lever to direct or steer a vehicle, which is yet another nice subtle nod for repeat watchers. But the owner rambles in response, referring to the cabin as the old Buckner place, making an implicit warning by saying that some fool is always willing to sell that land. He's seen plenty come and go, ever since the war. However, the warning goes entirely over Jules's head. Instead, she asks which war he means, and the owner growls that she knows damn well which war. Clearly a bit touchy that he's aged like an avocado in an easy-bake oven. Or, fuck it, an avocado at basic room temperature. Marty sidles in, asking if it was the war between guys in blue and grey, with brother fighting brother. The owner asks if he's sassing him, and as Kurt and Jules smirk, Marty points out that he was rude to his friend. Fair's fair. But the owner asks if he means the whore, instantly getting Kurt's back up and turning the atmosphere from tense to highly flammable. Holden tries to defuse the situation by getting in Kurt's way, saying they have enough gas, but the owner goads them by saying they only have enough to get them there, and getting back is their concern. Now, this is not only an effective character scene, since it shows how both Kurt and Marty are protective of Jules in diametrically opposed ways, Kurt physically, Marty verbally, but all the time we're getting more and more fragments of information that add up to something being amiss. For example, why is the owner so far from civilization, yet so hostile to new business? Is he drinking the gas? What the fuck is he doing out here? And why did he call Jules a whore? It could have just been a snap judgment from a crotchety old gammon, but does it point to something more significant? But whatever his reasons were, the owner has ensured that the caravan is still low on fuel, meaning the gang's capability to go home is now well and truly scuppered, and by insulting Jules, he has made the leader of the group angry enough to not want to fight to do business with him, meaning the gang have no option but to press on to the cabin. And if you're into your horrors, this kind of setup isn't anything you haven't seen before, except as the gang drive through a mountain tunnel bordering a deep canyon, we see a bird of prey drift into an invisible force field and vaporise upon impact, visually establishing to us that the gang have unknowingly crossed some kind of man-made threshold. The existence of this sophisticated technology fills in some of the corners of the jigsaw this film is building up, since we now know we're clearly not dealing with the usual horror fixture of a lone nutter in the woods, but a bigger and more organised entity, with resources it intends to use strategically and with purpose. And what's the purpose of building a threshold? Anyway, the gang eventually arrive at the titular cabin in the woods and enter their rooms, where Holden finally gets some time to shine. Seeing that his room has been decorated with a delightful picture of an animal being horribly slaughtered by some men, who IMDb informs me are the previously mentioned Buckners, Holden decides he doesn't want to sleep with it on the wall and removes it, only to find it hides a one-way mirror between his and Dana's rooms. As Holden tries to make sense of the situation, he takes some amusement in Dana looking at herself in her mirror, unaware of what's going on, until she starts to undress, yanking Holden straight back to reality cock first. But despite some initial conflict, Holden eventually makes a decision to call out for her to stop, demonstrating that while there's a definite attraction there, ultimately, Holden isn't a prick, and actually values and respects Dana as her own person. Once the gang have appraised the weirdness of a one-way mirror being in a cabin in the woods, they leave Dana and Holden alone again, and Holden, picking up on Dana's clear but silent discomfort, suggests that she may feel more comfortable if they swap rooms. Relieved, Dana agrees, thanking him for being decent, which I imagine she would be appreciative of, since her recent history with her teacher doesn't have a decent thing about it. Holden says it isn't a big deal, and that being decent is the least he can do, since Kurt and Jules sold Dana to him for marriage, and Dana says they aren't subtle, seeming at least a little relieved that the awkwardness of the situation is being felt both ways. Now with the sense that he's in a safe position to test the waters a bit, Holden takes the wheel by gently conveying his attraction with some witty flirting, admitting to some internal conflict in his decision to call out, shouting on both sides, blood spilled. Dana, deciding to throw caution to the wind and improvise a bit, responds that if he's bleeding internally, he should talk to Jules, since she's a pre-med, cringing with the rest of us as her brain catches up with her mouth. And this scene is efficient in a number of ways. On the surface, it showcases Holden and Dana's mutual attraction through their flirtation, one subtle, witty and confident, one, well, trying. But while a lesser film would have just used this as an easy opportunity for a simple moment of throwaway awkward angsty humour, in Cabin, this moment is also showing that, despite Dana being fresh out of an emotionally confusing relationship, she is at least somewhat willing to try and pursue something healthier, with her woeful flirting attempt showing that, unlike Holden, Dana doesn't get much practice initiating romantic exchanges. After all, why would she, with all these grey, saggy men throwing themselves at her? But this also fulfills a fourth minor purpose, quickly cluing us into the fact that Jules studies medicine, ensuring that her considerable intellect is kept fresh in our minds for scenes that are fast approaching. Why can't more scripts be efficient like this one? Anyway, Dana and Holden switch rooms, but a little dodgily, considering Dana couldn't have possibly got the painting back up on the wall yet, Holden immediately starts changing his clothes. Dana, visibly impressed at his football player musculature, panics as Holden starts just getting fully fucking naked, and she quickly replaces the frame, establishing that she also has a sense of decency, even in the face of high-speed aggressive nudity. Now, I confess, I neglected a scene earlier, which splits up the drive to the petrol station. In this scene, we return to Hadley and Citizen in the facility from the film's opening. As they enter a control room, the two meet Truman, their new security detail, whose status as a virtual newcomer to the organisation makes him our surrogate, since his learning of this new environment will facilitate our own. Anyway, Hadley, having access to surveillance inside the cabin, reports to an underling that Dana and Holden have swapped rooms. Lynn reappears to provide the duo with the updated chem report, letting us know that they're able to remotely monitor the team's bodily status in real time, which I'd like you to remember for later. Being sure to include a jab about Hadley's earlier comment about the chem department letting the side down, Lynn reports that Jules' hair dye is lowering her cognitive ability, and that she also has plans to introduce a libido-raising chemical for the others, which can be inhaled or ingested. Hearing Lynn give this report lets us understand a key component of how the organisation operate, developing chemicals to influence the behaviour of their, let's call them subjects. Now we know this is an element, combined with the Google employee, the encounter at the gas station, and the force field, we gain a clearer picture of the order of events so far, and come to understand that the gang have been manipulated into some sort of trap, a trap they still remain blissfully unaware of. But what have the gang stumbled into? Who are these people whose office jobs involve drugging and running surveillance on teenagers? What's the purpose? You'll find out when you stop liking being teased, you submissive little cuck! We also get an additional humorous scene involving Hadley interacting with the gas station owner over the phone, revealing him to be an actor of sorts, which explains his earlier hostility toward people literally trying to hand him money. People may write this sequence off as standard Whedon-esque humour, which in all fairness is one hell of a lot harder than people think it is, But fucking hell, Bradley Whitford and Richard Jenkins are having so much fun in this scene that it just gets me every single time. However, I've already said too much, and I won't disservice the scene by describing it further. And for anyone wondering why I haven't pointed out anything wrong with the plot yet, well, providing I can sufficiently explain the presence of the one-way mirror, there isn't anything wrong with the plot yet. Everything's doing exactly what it needs to be doing so far. Isn't that nice? Anyway, while the gang are all catching cholera in the nearby lake, in the facility we see a screen with live displays of each of our protagonists, which, as well as showing their location in the cabin, displays a live feed of their heartbeats. But Hadley and Citizen aren't so concerned with this screen, as they're busy running a betting pool for everyone in the facility, although what precisely is being wagered on is left for us to infer. Hadley, reading some of the tickets, comments that one department is just giving their money away, but his usual blasé exterior vanishes when Citizen says, "You're one to talk, Aquaman." Hadley, actually looking kind of hurt, asks what he means, but Citizen recognises that he's nearing a sensitive spot and drops it, busying himself by taking more wagers. Which is interesting, since from what we've seen of Hadley and Citizen so far, they haven't exactly had much care for emotional boundaries or general sparing of feelings. Yet, despite his flippant attitude, we see here that Hadley takes at least one thing to heart, whatever it might be, and that, at least when it comes to Hadley, Citizen isn't willing to prod if it's likely to result in genuine upset, implying that he actually considers Hadley to be a genuine friend, rather than just a colleague. Again, this stuff may sound trivial, but characters can really gain dimension when certain circumstances force them to divert from their usual behaviours, and it's another thing contributing toward these characters feeling like real people. Moving on, Citizen is handed another ticket, and after reading it, he says he's not even sure if they have one of those. But the employee informs him that the zoology department says they do, and Citizen concedes that they'd know. And again, this dialogue is doing quite a tightrope walk in how it parcels out information to hold a first-time viewer's intrigue. After all, whatever kind of organisation this is, what utility would it have for a zoology department? We won't find out right away, but the film's quite content to leave us only with the knowledge that there is one, to encourage us to wait for an explanation later. But while Hadley and Citizen continue gathering wagers, Lynn notices Truman standing apart, asking if he's going to bet. Truman says no, politely, neither judging nor condemning. Yet all the same, Lynn looks embarrassed, saying she knows it seems harsh, but everyone's just blowing off steam. The job isn't easy, despite how Hadley and Citizen may make it look. Still, no direct information, but between Lynn's guilty conscience in the face of Truman's quiet refusal to join in, we have enough context clues to infer this isn't going to end well for the teens. Truman asks if Upstairs knows about the gambling, cluing us into the existence of Hadley and Citizen's superiors, but Hadley overhears and says they don't care, as long as everything runs smoothly. And speaking of smoothly, Truman asks how they can wager on something where they control the outcome, doing his method job very well by asking what we're all thinking. But Hadley says they just need to get the teens into the cellar, the rest is up to them. And as an example of how the system works, Citizen uses the gas station owner, referring to him as the Harbinger, a creepy old mutant who the teens need to encounter in order to refuel, but whose hostility will prompt them to ignore him and press on empty-handed. The choice to continue is theirs, for if the teens were forced into making these decisions against their will, their mission would fail. But since the gang have travelled so far already, the chances they'll choose to turn back because of some old weirdo is pretty unlikely. Thus, the organisation has stacked circumstance upon circumstance to direct the teens into making the decisions they need them to, with the Harbinger, planted at a gas station doubtlessly situated in a carefully calculated location, ensuring that that choice remains their own. And here, exposition is skillfully delivered to us in a completely organic exchange between a newcomer asking questions and two very experienced characters providing him with answers, with Truman's learning also bringing us closer to having a complete understanding of what exactly is going on here. See, exposition has become a bit of a dirty word in recent years, but what a lot of writers don't understand is that it doesn't all have to be done in one big lazy dump, delivered directly and unblinkingly to the viewer. In the case of Cabin in the Woods, we see that taking the time to eke out your exposition almost becomes a story in of itself, and can be all the more intriguing for it. And as yet another example of this, Hadley invites Truman to bet, saying that the window's closing. Truman, unflinching, politely says that he's fine, but Lynn, guiltily looking away, hands Hadley her wager, which, as a visual, comes with the implication that morality is the price for a long career in this organisation. But why are all these people so willing to pay that price? And if Lynn isn't the only one feeling guilty, why would anyone stay in employment here? Cut back to the cabin, where I'm finally getting to cash in a cheque I've been hinting at pretty much all video. The gang start partying, and I think it's reasonable to infer that while they were out at the lake in a previous scene, The keg was spiked with the libido-raising drug that Lynn was talking about earlier. The gang start playing Truth or Dare, and Marty goes first, daring Jules to make out with a taxidermy wolf head framed on the wall. Which Jules does, with a discomforting level of enthusiasm. Yeah, it's weird. But as a display of how much of a departure it is from Jules' normal behaviour, it's perfect, and is aided heavily by the others' surprised reactions. This is expressed in different forms. Kurt is obviously thrilled at it, quaffing the libido-enhancing beer and loudly voicing his approval, and Marty, giggling at it, is obviously quite high. But Dana's concerned reaction conveys to us in no uncertain terms that Jules acting in this way is completely opposite to what she's seen before. Now, very important distinction. I've been sure to mention Jules' intelligence a lot leading up to this scene, and while I'm not conflating being overtly sexual with a decrease in intelligence, although it's probably smarter to not lick taxidermy in a dirty cabin in the woods, it's clear that Jules' lowered cognition is making her express her sexuality in a much different method to the discreet, witty, targeted dialogue we saw right at the beginning, instead favouring a very physical display and revelling in having all eyes on her. And despite the fact that we haven't had a lot of time with these characters, the actors' performances allow us to understand this perfectly. The taxidermy tonsil tennis comes thankfully to an end, and Dana's turn is next. But Kurt obnoxiously railroads her, characterising Dana as a right Velma by anticipating that she'll say truth, or get a dare she doesn't like, then say truth. Dana, visibly annoyed, defiantly says dare, and right on cue the basement door swings open, and my eyes glaze over as I think back to a happier time, when Sam Raimi used to make good, non-MCU things. And Kurt, his chemically enhanced erection clearly diverting too much blood from his brain at this point, says that the basement door must have been blown open by the wind. But Marty asks what kind of sense that makes, which as well as having the potential to be a funny exchange by itself, also achieves the double purpose of giving us an early clue into the fact that, while Jules and Kurt's cognitions have taken a noticeable hit from Lynn's chemicals, Marty's actually still fairly lucid, likely because at this point his cognition has been made hard and calloused by the absolute kicking it gets every day. Anyway, Jules gives Dana her dare, to investigate the basement, which she eventually does in defiance of Kurt's taunting. However, while walking carefully in the dark, she accidentally illuminates a photo of Anna Buckner and cries out, causing them all to come running. Kurt says she failed the dare, following that by forgetting he's not in a porno and saying that the forfeit is to remove her top. And while Dana gives him a very justified, withering look, Marty lights a lantern, revealing a collection of strange horror items. Holden, looking around, says Kurt's cousin is into some weird shit, though Kurt theorises it belongs to the same people who installed the one-way mirror. But the more they explore, the more they fixate on certain objects, as if in a trance. Holden's attention is caught by a music box. Jules admires a wedding outfit and goes to put on a pendant of some sort. Kurt picks up a conch, then puts it down in favour of a puzzle ball. And Dana opens a book, the diary of Anna Buckner. Even Marty, the most vocal about going back upstairs, starts to succumb, going quiet as he notices a film projector. And as the tension rises, Dana breaks their trances by reading Anna Buckner's diary aloud, which recounts tales of horrendous and prolonged redneck-themed nastiness, depicting torture, cannibalism, and bulges. The segment ends with a passage in Latin, because of course it does, and Marty, the only member of the gang who seems to have seen a film in his life, draws a line in the sand, telling her not to read the Latin. Though an ethereal voice whispers to read it out loud, and Marty, seemingly the only one to hear it, flies into a panic. Kurt shoves him and tells him to stop being such a fucking baby, letting Dana read the Latin passage, and somewhere in the woods we see an arm menacingly unearth itself from a grave, putting an end to all this glorious setup and kicking the horror premise into gear, spelling doom for our protagonists, but with so much more justification than the usual setup of having a character just reading the spooky Latin aloud because they're bored or something. And also, unlike the garden variety horror movie, we may actually care about these characters being in peril, since they've been characterised to resemble real people with personality traits and senses of humour and stuff, as opposed to the usual obnoxious dick-headed wanker horror leads who, I imagine, are exactly who Jules and Kurt are supposed to be emulating while under Lynn's influence. Back at the facility, the sweepstakes are released, and we find out that the facility was, in fact, betting on which monster would be summoned to gruesomely murder our teens, which was the Buckners, the redneck zombie torture family. But on the list, we also see regular zombies, werewolves, vampires, deadites, sexy witches, angry molesting trees, dismemberment goblins, and Kevin. It's a fun freeze frame, and if you're a keen meme hunter, here you'll find the meme that got used every month of 2020 in its natural habitat. But someone's not very happy. Hadley, looking like he's quietly shitting himself with rage, is approached by a citizen who says he's very sorry, and Hadley yells out in frustration, since, with the conch, Kurt had very nearly summoned a merman, a creature that we realise Hadley has never seen before, which helps us understand Citizen's Aquaman comment from earlier. Attempting to provide Hadley with a consolation, Citizen says that mermen are terrifying and generate a lot of cleanup, with Citizen's familiarity with this monster implying that he's been a part of this organisation for an awful lot longer than Hadley, which I'd like you to keep in mind for later. But now we've had an amusing display of Hadley, Citizen, and the wider organisation's blasé attitude toward putting the lives of 5 teens in danger, it's entirely possible that the comedic tone would make us forget the significance of what exactly is going on, if not for Truman, who's understandably a bit fucking rattled to be confronted with the reality of monsters, magic, and gods. Lynn attempts to comfort him, saying he'll get used to it, but Truman earnestly asks if they should, bringing the comedic tone provided by Citizen and Hadley straight back down to earth. And while we can understand the betting pool as a mass coping mechanism for the awful necessity of the job, the motive of which is still unclear, as a newcomer, Truman is perfectly placed to look at where this new job leads, and judge the heavy concept of whether it's a path worth taking. Honestly, I miss when films could actually balance comedy with serious moral concepts. But anyway, Hadley and Citizen seem happy with the Buckners, since their 100% success rate means that Japan can take their 100% success rate and wave it around to someone who gives a shit. But here we're also treated to a flash of the Japanese setup, which, unlike the American setup, shows a Samara-type monster terrorising a classroom of young girls, which nicely solidifies that each division of the organisation operates according to the dominant horror conventions of the culture, which is a little touch that wasn't completely necessary, but it's proof that someone on the set gave a fuck. It was a different time, 2012. Back at the cabin, Jules is wiggling her posterior to the amusement of all, and Marty, clearly uncomfortable, comments on how classy the party's become. Kurt, in response, asks if Marty wouldn't want a piece of that, objectifying Jules in a way that we've seen he would have only joked about previously. Jules, trying to get Marty on side, stops fingering Holden's chest long enough to tell a story about how she and Marty used to be college sweethearts, taking his spliff and smoking it sensually in his face, eyes lingering, seeming to enjoy watching Marty squirm. And again, if you're a horror fan, this dickish behaviour isn't anything you haven't seen before. But considering Marty's status as a long-term friend of both Kurt and Jules, the fact that both of them are treating him this way shows blatant disregard for his feelings, highlighting just how far gone they both are. Marty's saved by Dana, who suggests Jules take a lie down, and Kurt, manhandling Jules out of the door, makes a crass joke that laying down is exactly the point. Clearly deciding that there's still room to be even more of a prat, he then makes a joke about Egghead Holden de-virginising Dana, living up to the dumb jock stereotype he very clearly wasn't in the film's opening, since, as Jules' boyfriend, he would definitely have awareness of Dana's relationship with her teacher. And while this asinine schoolboy jab is obviously a symptom of Lynn's influence, Kurt's choice of insult, virgin, is interesting, considering it's the exact diametric opposite of what Jules was called by the gas station owner. With Jules and Kurt gone, Marty attempts to appeal to Dana that their behaviour is highly out of character, even considering their drunkenness, that he's never seen Jules act like an attention-seeking celebutard, nor Kurt, the sociology graduate with a full academic scholarship, engage in alpha male bullshit like calling people egghead. Something is wrong. Dana dismisses this as simple weed-induced paranoia, but Marty, becoming disappointed to find out his friend is a goddamn dirty normie, mumbles that she doesn't see what she doesn't want to see, muttering about puppeteers as he shuffles back to his room, leaving Dana and Holden alone once again. And it turns out that Holden, now wearing some nerd glasses, is reading Anna Buckner's diary, explaining that he studied Latin in 10th grade. This seems to come entirely out of left field, probably because Holden hasn't yet proven himself to be as cerebral as the others, probably because he isn't, generally. But anyway, this newfound intellect makes things start heating up between them, and as they start kissing, Dana, as a reflex, tenses up. Holden promises he won't do anything she doesn't want, and Dana begins to explain that she's never had sex before, but then catches herself, looking confused, because while Kurt forgetting that Dana isn't a virgin could be at least somewhat explained, the same obviously can't be said for her. But what could be the purpose of these chemicals making even Dana forget that she's engaged in the sex? Speaking of the sex, we cut to Kurt and Jules prancing through the woods like a couple of horny deerfolk, with Kurt trying to convince her to bump Ugly's al fresco. Jules doesn't even seem to be completely against the idea, but as Kurt starts to unbutton her shirt, Jules rebuttons it again, saying she's chilly, much to the dismay of all the Y chromosomes watching from the facility. Luckily, Hadley and Citizen are on the case, activating devices that pump more pheromones into the area. Concerns of chilliness now far behind them, Jules and Kurt continue to make out, laying down in a comfortable spot and beginning to undress, despite the fact that the woods is a place where animals shit absolutely everywhere. Hadley and Citizen watch eagerly, attempting to telepathically will Jules into showing her jewels. And Truman, mistaking their enthusiasm for perversion, and clearly uncomfortable with the ethics of this chemically manipulated voyeurism, questions the necessity. But Hadley says they're not the only ones watching, with Citizen adding that they have to keep the customer satisfied, asking if Truman knows what's at stake. And these lines of dialogue instantly reframe our understanding of the facility, now implying that the central goal mentioned earlier is all done for the benefit of some other unseen entity, and that if this entity is not happy with what it sees, the mission will fail and invite dire consequences. Much to their relief, Jules gets her tits out, and Hadley and Citizen both relax, as if having just ticked off a checkbox. Now this has been done, the zombified Buckner family, now out of their graves, are free to ambush, stabbing Jules in the hand and Kurt in the back, then holding him still while Jules is grabbed and horribly decapitated. It's pretty grisly shit, and a situation none of us would wish upon our worst enemy. And while with this we might be tempted to label Hadley and Citizen as inhumanly callous and cruel, the duo are completely stone-faced, clearly having taken no pleasure in Jules' death. Apart from one moment, these two have consistently refused to take anything seriously, to a degree that even their colleagues consider to be a departure from the norm. Yet with Jules' successful murder, the two are completely sober and humourless. And seeing these two share in this silence indicates to us that this sacrifice was nothing to be joked about, and we realise that this is the part of the job that is never spoken of, the part that causes each and every facility employee to feel that their morality has been compromised. When they make their jokes, Hadley and Citizen are trying to suppress the guilt that comes from luring these young adults to their premature and hideous deaths, because despite whatever shame they may feel, they also know that this act is completely necessary and justified, and we're about to find out why. Citizen, pulling a pendant from inside his shirt, recites a mantra of sacrifice to slumbering gods, given in humility and fear, and Hadley pulls a lever, activating a machine that smashes a canister of lamb blood and processes it through to a stone slab, etched with an image of a woman, an etching which, we will come to understand, symbolises the whore. With Jules' death, we nearly have a full understanding of what's going on here, a kind of ritual where the teens are manipulated into fulfilling certain behaviours to match typical character archetypes of the horror genre, to then be sacrificed by a horror monster for the entertainment of old-world gods. Failing to complete this ritual correctly will presumably invite the upset of these gods, and Hadley, Citizen, and everyone in the organisation believe that that upset is severe enough for this ritual to be necessary, despite the obvious moral conflicts that come with it. Here we see Marty's misgivings towards society given form. In the face of the wrath of an angry deity, the organisation have decided that the sacrifice of teens is preferable, and while it's a hideous concept, we can't exactly pretend that we wouldn't make the same decision in their place. And with this scene, Cabin crystallises all the information we've been trying to make sense of, and now our understanding is basically complete. We change gears to be concerned for what lies ahead for our four remaining protagonists. Back at the cabin, Marty's starting to become paranoid, hearing the same ethereal voice from earlier, suggesting he take a walk. In a show of defiance, Marty yells back at it that he's not a puppet, nor will he engage in a little puppet dance. Then, deciding he needs some air, goes for a walk. Easy humour? Perhaps. But you know, stoners. Moving outside, Marty looks up at the night sky, noting that there aren't any stars. How odd. But Kurt has managed to escape the Buckners in the meantime, which, considering his background as a football player, I'm absolutely fine with. And with a timely clothesline to save Marty from the approaching Anna Buckner, gets them both inside, barring the door and yelling that they're leaving. Dana demands to know where Jules is, and Kurt, still in shock, says she's gone. But Dana, not accepting this, goes to open the door, saying she isn't leaving without her, only to find her path blocked by Matthew Buckner, who looks like a gigantic goth built like a particularly leaky outhouse. As Dana backs away in fear, Matthew Buckner tosses Jules' severed head into her arms, and Dana screams in horror. Understandably. But Holden and Kurt take the initiative, shutting and barring the door on Matthew. After sharing what they know, Dana pieces together that their attackers are the Buckners, and, clearly horrified, makes the connection that her reading the diary has led to Jules' murder, which is all communicated wordlessly, due to some excellent acting from Kristen Connolly. But despite this, the gang resolve to hole up, barricade all entrances, and fight back as a group, no matter what. Hearing this, Hadley pinches the bridge of his nose in frustration, but Citizen says to watch the master work, activating a chemical inside the cabin. More evidence to Citizen's seniority, which will be relevant soon, I swear. And upon inhaling this chemical, Kurt changes his mind, returning back to the world of horror trope idiocy by saying they should split up and cover more ground. Marty rightfully questions this, but as Matthew Buckner breaks one of the windows to the cabin, the four panic and, working off of Kurt's last instruction, run into their individual rooms. Citizen then locks their doors behind them like clockwork, demonstrating that coordinating situations like this is something that just comes naturally to him at this point, giving us more evidence of why he holds such a high status within the organisation. Marty, bless him, is next to the chopping block. While scrambling about his room and shutting his window, he accidentally knocks a lamp over that reveals the wiretap in his room, finally giving him confirmation of his puppeteers, only for him to be yanked out of his window by Judah Buckner. Managing to wrestle free and give Judah a decent smack with his didgeridoo, Marty attempts to get away, but sadly the zombie throws a knife into his back, then drags him screaming into the woods and out of view, save for a little blood spurt indicating a nasty end for our favourite stoner. Okay, second favourite. Just as he did with Jules's death, and presumably having checked the live feed because, you know, why wouldn't you? Hadley pulls another lever for Marty's sacrifice to be processed, completing the sacrifice for the fool. But for some reason, doing this causes a menacing rumble to come from below the chamber. Implying that these are physical beings underneath the earth, Hadley attributes this to the gods being particularly excited, and Citizen seems to agree. And we'll be coming back to this, so hold that thought. Dana, seeming to regain access to a working brain, pulls up the floorboards in her room, yelling out to the others to do the same. Mother Buckner suddenly bursts in and attacks, but after hearing Dana's screams, Holden uses a lamp to smash through the one-way mirror and help her into his room to escape. Now, this mirror obviously won't come into play later, so I'm forced to hint at a small spoiler now that explains its presence, especially if, like me, you questioned the practicality of it being in the cabin. I think chiefly the mirror was installed to create opportunities for characters to exhibit certain behaviours, since, just as Jules had to exhibit certain behaviours before being sacrificed, resisting the temptation to voyeur on people changing, or not, might be relevant to a certain archetype. But also, it is highly, highly important to the organisation that Dana is not killed just yet, so this mirror may be here expressly for the purpose to allow someone to come to her aid if need be, exactly as Holden has done here. That being said, she'd be shit out of luck if she happened to pick Marty's room at the beginning, so maybe I'm just being overly charitable because I'm biased! Holden saves Dana from Mother Buckner and the two escape down through a trap door, with Holden instructing Kurt to join them in the basement. While searching for an exit, Holden, presumably reverting back to his idiot self, seems to have forgotten that the Buckners were literally right behind them, walking back under the trap door, where he's run over by that car from earlier. I mean, he walked back under the trap door, giving Matthew Buckner the chance he needs to snag him by surprise, with Matthew using his bear trap on a chain weapon to yank him up off his feet. Desperately, Dana grabs Holden, weighing him down and unbalancing Matthew into falling into the hole himself. How embarrassing. With Matthew now hanging upside down from the trap door, Dana takes the chance to impale him to the wall with a spike, both injuring and immobilising him. Good going, Dana. As Matthew loses consciousness, Dana, clearly on a bit of a high, decides now's the time for a hot and spicy quip, and goes for, "You like pain? How's that working out for you?" And I do not love this line, to be honest, but for a character experiencing a lot of adrenaline right now, like, you know, whatever. Anyway, as the two back away after a few more precautionary stabs to Matthew's big lumpy face, Kurt bursts in through an outside door, and after informing them that Marty has been killed, all three get in the caravan and make for the mountain tunnel, though none of them notice the bloody handprint left on the door. But I'm sure it'll be fine. Back at the facility, it turns out that Japan has somehow fucked up their 100% success rate for the first time ever, with the schoolgirls having sung a song to turn Samara into a happy frog, much to Citizen's, let's say, enthusiastic disappointment. And as Lynn explains, this leaves the American setup as the last ritual remaining, instantly cranking the stakes to maximum, since if Hadley and Citizen fail, the organisation fails as a whole, and the wrath of the ancients will be incited. And to make matters worse, Hadley, watching the surveillance cameras, notices that the mountain tunnel, the one the teens are currently en route to, is still open, though Citizen says it should have been blown hours ago. I'll be coming back to this later too. Citizen runs as fast as he can to get to the demolition room, and quickly learns that the demolition team didn't receive the order to block the tunnel due to a glitch in the communications systems. Then Citizen uses his years of experience to blow the tunnel manually while the gang are halfway through. Forced to turn back, they park up on the side of the canyon, and Kurt removes his dirt bike from the back of the caravan, intending to jump back over to get help. Holden contributes his nerd powers to work out if the trajectory of the jump is viable. How odd. I remember the days when he used to leap into traffic, this morning. But Kurt is already committed to the plan, not just motivated by mere revenge, but the desire to save his friends. The selfish loudmouth jock is long gone, and now only Kurt, the smart and likeable Hemsworthian hunk we met in the opening, stands in his place. And yes, perhaps I will go marry him because I do love him so much. Dana gives him a peck on the cheek before he goes, and Kurt, with no time to lose, gives himself a run-up and revs his engine to maximum. And as Dana and Holden watch Kurt, their last hope for rescue, sail over the gorge, he crashes into the force field we saw from earlier, and the bike explodes, sending Kurt plummeting to his death, completing the sacrifice for the athlete. It's here that Dana comes to the horrible realisation that Marty's theory of puppeteers was correct, and she and Holden return to the caravan, with Holden, poor unlucky bastard, saying that Dana, a girl he's known less than a day, is all he has left now, resolving to just keep driving straight until they find help, although Dana is convinced they'll never make it. And sadly, Dana winds up being proven right, as Daddy Buckner chooses this moment to strike from the back of the caravan for peak dramatic effect, killing Holden from behind with the old classic scythe to the neck. And in his death throes, Holden loses control of the caravan, which careens off the road and into the lake. Anyway, Dana survives somehow and manages to escape the submerged caravan, swimming to the surface, managing to get to shore and right into the waiting arms of Matthew Buckner. While Dana fights for her life against this giant sadistic zombified man, Hadley and Citizen celebrate with the rest of their staff. Truman, the only one still watching Dana on the monitor, asks if they're not going to confirm the kill. But Hadley explains that whether the Virgin lives or dies is immaterial, so long as she suffers, and that the other four are killed first. So as far as they're concerned, their job is done, and humanity is saved. As the festivities continue, Citizen approaches the demolition team to dispense a bit of shit their way, but, completely unamused by this, they assert that it was down to a glitch that came from a power reroute from upstairs. Last thing to keep in mind, I'm about to tie this all together. And as if on cue, the partying is interrupted by the ringing of a phone. Visibly thunderstruck, Hadley tells them to turn the music off, taking the call. After some time, he looks back to the monitors, seeing Matthew Buckner, who could kill Dana at any moment, and asks which one of the sacrifices is still alive. And once again, as our understanding of the situation has crystallised, Cabin drastically shifts gears. Back at the lake, an injured Dana watches Matthew Buckner towering over her, realising that she's about to die, as he swings his bear trap on a chain weapon around in a wide circle. However, before he can dispense a killing blow, thus ending the world, the bear trap snags on something behind him, a certain gigantic didgeridoo wielded by a certain Marty, who uses this surprise leverage to pull the zombified and mostly brain-dead Matthew into falling over, with Dana also hitting him with a bit of wood to knock him into the lake for good measure. Wasting no time, Dana and Marty head back toward the cabin, but with Anna Buckner giving chase and Matthew not far behind, Marty directs them to his hiding spot, a grave, concealing a small room leading to an elevator in the underground facility, where the partly sentient remains of Judah Buckner lie, who Marty managed to dismember while being pulled off screen, which explains his miraculous survival. Or at least, kind of. Marty, with his arm already halfway inside a control box, says that he's been playing around, and he thinks he can make the elevator go down. Dana asks if they want to go down, but Marty asks where else they can go. And so, for lack of a better option, Marty and Dana drop into the elevator, Marty accidentally slipping on Judah's arm and other body parts on his way down, much to his frustration, and they begin their descent into the facility. As the elevator descends, Marty and Dana come face to face with the organisation's entire menagerie, every horror creature at their disposal, segregated into transparent cubes. A werewolf, a ghost, a demon ballerina, a Pennywise, a giant snake, birthday cake, large fries, chocolate shake, they're all there. And a Cenobite, which is holding what Dana recognises as an identical puzzle ball to the one that Kurt was holding in the basement earlier, with her making the connection that the facility made them choose which monster would kill them, with the cold, sinister weight of that fact closing in on her as she screams. But we'll get back to that, because I have some housekeeping to do. Item 1. Considering how long Hadley and Citizen have been part of the organisation, it's a little odd that when Marty died, neither of them recognised the rumbling that came from the chamber as an indication his death wasn't legitimate, especially when no other death prompted that reaction. I'm willing to accept that Hadley, as the younger of the two, may not have experienced this happening before, but I don't think the same applies to Citizen, whose familiarity with mermen and technical expertise indicates he's been here for much longer. Now, considering this expertise, I think it's safe to imply that Citizen has had a lengthy career, and in that time I think it's a little unlikely that Marty's the first teen that's ever survived an encounter with a monster. After all, we see that these monsters can be defeated when the Japanese sacrifices survive, and we already know of one failed ritual at this branch, since Hadley mentioned it in the film's very first scene. Were the gods completely inert for that one? Regardless, if anyone was going to notice something was wrong after the sacrifice for the Fool, Citizen should have been the one to recognise it. But we now arrive at item 2. Marty being alive should have been noticed much earlier. And first, we're forced to consider the reality that no one checked the screen that shows the teen's current locations and live heartbeat feeds, which surely must be checked as a matter of course when completing sacrifices. Had Citizen or Hadley even just taken a moment to glance at this screen, they would have realised Marty was still alive, and could have reacted accordingly, ensuring humanity's survival. And even if Hadley and Citizen are too busy to check the live status screen, which is a hard swallow anyway, considering this is the core purpose of the facility, you'd think that someone would be on hand too, especially since Lynn herself established that one of the main roles of the chem department is to remotely check their vitals in real time. And sure, put it down to human error if you want, but considering that 4 teens must be confirmed to be killed before the 5th for the world to not end, it's kind of ridiculous that Marty being alive is something that isn't noticed by anyone until the second he returns to save Dana. Which brings us to item 3, namely the mountain tunnel not being blown already, which is significant since the gang could have escaped and fucked the whole operation sky high. Demolition said that they never received the order to initiate the cave-in due to an electrical error, later explained to be a power reroute, which an internet forum tells me is due to the fact that shortly after dismembering Judah, Marty started fucking around with the control box and accidentally caused a short. But when the gang are attempting to escape through the tunnel, Citizen says it was supposed to be blown hours prior, so the call to detonate the tunnel should have gone much earlier than the point that Marty gains access to the electric box. So I think this theory might be bullshit. And ultimately, I'm not completely sure why it wasn't just standard procedure to blow the tunnel as soon as the gang are out of earshot. After all, according to Marty, they're off the grid without phone signal, and with the force field in place, there's fuck all they could do even if they did find out about it. So the fact that the order hasn't been given before the teens are well on their way toward the tunnel, especially considering the weight of what's at stake, fucks up what we've been led to believe concerning the efficiency of the organisation, and how we should reasonably expect them to operate based on the information we have. All for the sake of a tense and exciting scene. Which brings us to item 4, Dana. As the Virgin, Dana's death is optional, but only if it's the final one, meaning that if she dies early, the ritual fails and the world ends. Which means that, with Holden's sudden death culminating with the caravan plummeting into the lake with Dana inside, the facility are fucking lucky that the assassin zombie redneck kills Holden instead of Dana. They are fucking lucky that Dana survives the impact of the fall, trapped underwater inside a rapidly sinking caravan, and they are fucking lucky that Marty's there in time to save her from Anna Buckner. Which means that the survival of Dana, and humanity as a whole, is built on a bedrock of multiple instances of absolute blind fucking luck all compounding in on itself. It's not to say that this makes Cabin a bad film overall, but on reflection, the mechanics surrounding Marty's presumed death build into a couple of enormous contrivances, and considering the implied weight of the organisation's core function, and how long they've been operating, these 4 points are very damaging toward demonstrating the facility's level of competence. Back at the control room, Lynn doesn't explain why no one was looking at the live feed of Marty's heartbeat, but does explain that Marty's weed was immunising him to their chemicals, which is why Marty was always the most lucid one of the group, ironically. And Hadley, asking what help that is now, mobilises the facility troops, instructing them to kill Marty before Dana, or they're all doomed. Back in the elevator, Dana is currently being held by Marty in a standing spoon position, since with all of their friends dead, their surroundings 100% filled with horrible monsters, both literally and figuratively, and a future of uncertain length and destination ahead of them, a quiet, compassionate hug is probably what both of them need right now. But as the elevator comes to a halt, the doors rudely open to reveal a guard who holds them at gunpoint, ordering Dana to move away from Marty to give him a clear shot. Things look bleak, but Judah's sentient arm suddenly grabs the guard's leg, startling him, giving Marty and Dana the opening they need to stab him, disarm him, and escape, meaning they now have a knife and a gun. The two step out into an elevator room, but as they try to find a path out, a patrol of guards in riot gear open fire, forcing them to retreat back into a bulletproof control compartment. And as they close in, we hear a voice over the tannoy, Hadley and Citizen's superior, who sounds awfully familiar, telling Marty and Dana that if they survive the night, many people will die, so they should just let them get it over with quickly. And here we're treated to the best spectacle in the entire film. Dana, in defiance to this sentiment of just getting it over with, hits a big red button on the control panel, releasing every single monster into the crowded elevator room 8 at a time, unleashing absolute bloody carnage. And on reflection, I'm not entirely sure on what the utility of this button is in universe, or why the monster elevators come out into the control room, and since this is hugely consequential and how Dana and Marty escape, that's very fucking significant, unfortunately. But the resulting carnage is an absolute fucking marvellous spectacle to behold. I won't do a blow-by-blow because it's a lot of fun to just watch play out, but one thing I will mention is that the monsters break into the central control room, killing Lynn, Truman, whose reward for his unshakable morality is a heroic death where he gets to actually kill some of the monsters in kind, and lastly Hadley, who finally gets to see his merman. Back in the carnage of the elevator room, Anna Buckner limps serenely through the ankle-deep viscera, presumably homing in on the remaining people who are present for her resurrection ritual, even though Marty and Dana used her elevator cube to get down here. So logically, I'm not sure how she got another cube, especially with all the facility staff being so preoccupied at the moment. Like, does she have a concept of how to use an elevator? Was she just standing there mashing the down button because she didn't want to take the stairs? Anyway, Citizen manages to survive by moving down into the basement, but not for long, as he turns a corner and unfortunately runs belly first into Dana's knife. Knowing he has only one play left, with a certain ironic twist for a man who has spent his life puppeteering others, Citizen is forced to appeal to Dana to do what they cannot, and kill Marty herself. And as he dies, it seems increasingly clear to Dana that the people in the facility were engaging in this hideousness for a reason, that the voice over the tannoy mentioning that this is all in aid of saving countless lives is something that's beginning to nag at her. Marty, mistaking Dana's expression for shock, gives her the gun to reassure her, and you may expect me to call this a contrivance after hearing what Citizen just said, but honestly, I don't believe Marty thinks for a second that Dana would be conflicted about killing the people who killed their friends and who are trying to kill them. So as far as I'm concerned, this moment works. They both enter a chamber where we see the stone slabs with the sacrificial etchings, 4 out of 5 filled with blood, with a bottomless pit surrounding a central platform. Marty and Dana look around, trying to make sense of this, with Dana coming to the realisation that it was all a ritual, designed to punish them, the young, for the crime of non-Puritan behaviour. And for those who complained that the Buckners, as a zombie redneck torture family, were too generic a choice as the monsters for this horror setting, well, there's clearly some comparisons to draw between them and the old gods, which is about as far as I wish to elaborate, since these comparisons will necessarily force me to discuss subjects I'd really rather not dwell upon. Marty and Dana are approached by the big boss. Turns out Sigourney Weaver was behind it all, and she's here to make one last effort to explain the situation at hand, in the hope to convince Dana to kill Marty, or at least not try to save him. And here our characters get verbal confirmation of everything we've pieced together. To appease the old gods, the teens were manipulated into exhibiting behaviours as part of a ritualistic sacrifice, with each embodying one of 5 archetypes. The whore, embodied in Jules, the athlete, embodied in Kurt, the scholar, embodied in Holden, the fool, embodied in Marty, and the virgin, embodied in Dana. Dana, remembering once again that she has in fact done the sex, looks quizzical and questions her status as the virgin, and Sigourney shrugs, saying they work with what they have. This brings us full circle, and here we're treated to some meta-commentary. The Cabin in the Woods acts as a big metaphor for Hollywood horror, and the precarious nature of catering to a temperamental audience demanding familiar tropes and surface-level entertainment. As an extension of this, Jules, though an intelligent pre-med in a committed relationship, all things which should surely disqualify her as a candidate for the whore, had a certain comfort with her sexuality that, when boosted by chemically enhanced hair dye and pheromones, morphed her into an attention-seeking and self-centred horny bimbo to meet the requirements. Similarly, Kurt, a handsome and muscular football player of a similar academic intelligence, was fed beer laced with chemicals to raise his libido the drunker he got, accelerating his transition into a loudmouthed dumb jock, or the athlete. As a stoner, Marty easily embodies the fool already, forming 3/5 of our ensemble, which makes it all the funnier that, as the fool, he was the only one to see the facade for what it was, and ultimately bring this operation to its knees. Which brings us to Holden, who doesn't have quite as much presence in the dynamic, due to his quiet demeanour and the fact he's quite new to the friend group. Though established to be considerate, decent, and easygoing when it comes to Dana, his introduction as a football player without awareness for oncoming traffic led us to believe he's not quite as cerebral as the others. But after seeming to have been subjected to chemicals with the opposite effects of those given to Jules and Kurt, he suddenly gains access to 10th grade Latin and practical maths skills, now qualifying him as the scholar, complete with some nerd specs, courtesy of the arsehole he pulled them from. Which brings us to Dana, whose reluctance to throw herself into a sexual relationship after her experiences with her teacher make her the closest logical pick for the virgin, with chemicals that cause her to forget she's even had sex in the first place, helping her ease her into her assigned role. Seems perfect on paper, but Marty's weed was the fly in the ointment, giving him a level of chemical resistance to the methods of the facility, allowing him to survive his encounter with a murderous zombie redneck. And now, with the old gods confirmed to be real and the ritual as a necessary evil to protect humanity against their wrath, Marty is the one loose end, the character who should die if the facility's audience is to be appeased. And Dana, going through the exact same moral calculus as every single member of the facility's staff, points the gun at Marty, the enormity of what's at stake making her morally vindicate the sacrifice of her friends. For the survival of the human race, it's necessary. Marty, fully resenting the idea of obeying demands from people who killed all his friends, turns to Dana, obviously hurt at the betrayal. Dana says she's sorry, saying it's the whole world at stake. But Marty, noticing a werewolf approaching from behind, presumably smelling some live flesh, which is now undoubtedly a rarity upstairs, recognises it as the last option remaining to him, so neglects to warn Dana, saying he's sorry too. The werewolf attacks Dana, and a scuffle breaks out between Marty and Sigourney Weaver. After stunning her momentarily, Marty manages to get the gun, using it without hesitation to save Dana from the werewolf, but Sigourney knocks him to the ground, disarming him. As they continue to fight, Dana, bleeding heavily, notices Anna Buckner slowly approaching them, but unable to move, feebly calls out to warn Marty. Taking advantage of his distraction, Sigourney manages to get on top of him. Lucky bastard. But as she readies the gun, Anna Buckner lodges her axe in Sigourney's back, then Marty manages to kick them both into the pit. Now alone with no one to oppose them, Marty and Dana sit and share one last spliff as they apologise to each other, coming to the realisation that Kurt didn't even have a cousin in the first place. But ultimately, Dana has, indeed, come round to Marty's way of thinking, just as he promised Jules at the beginning of the story. Human society needs to crumble, and with the power to allow that resting squarely on their shoulders, they must have the resolve to stand firm and end the cycle of ritual sacrifice. And as the chamber collapses around them, the giant hand of an old god bursts from the earth, coming down on the viewer and cutting abruptly to black. Now, I fucking love this film, and even though writing this out has illuminated some big contrivances I'd never noticed before embarking on this absolute mission, I accept this and continue to love it anyway. Conceptually, I think the decision to make this story a big meta-commentary on the nature of appealing to audience satisfaction is nothing short of inspired, which for the most part is excellently realised. There's some strong, subtle, and above all efficient character stuff here, and everyone feels like they're real people, which is no mean feat, considering the subject matter we're dealing with. And honestly, the parts where the filmmakers allowed themselves to just be as creatively violent as they could are an absolute joy to behold. But as much as I love it, story-affecting inconsistencies need to be acknowledged, so just for the purposes of transparency, here is the system I'll be trying to stay consistent to. I will take half a point for a convenience, which I will define as a questionable event, character action, or circumstance, which could be explained, but which does have some consequence on the verisimilitude of the story, i.e. minor to moderate damage to world-building or characters. I will take 1 point for a contrivance, a highly unlikely event, character action, or circumstance that doesn't appear to have an explanation, which is of great consequence, i.e. major damage to world-building, character survival, and continuation of the plot. These definitions are absolutely broad as fuck, and ultimately the severity of conveniences and contrivances must be balanced against the consequences they have upon the plot and how explanations hold up. It's kind of a sliding scale, but hopefully this makes sense. The tunnel not being blown is a convenience. The theory with Marty causing the communication glitch that leaves the tunnel unexploded just doesn't add up, but since this theory isn't explicitly stated in the film, I won't hold it against it. However, this does leave the communication glitch now happening basically at random, which, while not impossible, is very convenient. And while you could argue that the gang's escape wouldn't amount to much, since the caravan was running close to empty, Kurt could have still travelled further on his dirt bike and got help. This ultimately damages our understanding of the facility's effectiveness, all for the sake of a tense and exciting scene. Daddy Buckner's ambush is a convenience. Daddy Buckner's hinted to be hiding in the caravan from the point when the gang first escape, demonstrating a level of cognition and tactical thinking that I'm not sure a zombie should have. This is significant, considering this kills Holden. Dana's luck is a contrivance. I think Holden being Daddy Buckner's first target could be explained by a base instinct to remove the bigger threat before attacking the weaker female. Not that the facility could rely on that. But the amount of luck that has to be at play for Dana to survive the impact of the fall into the lake is significant, considering Dana's death assures the end of the world. Marty's death going unnoticed is a contrivance. I think citizens' experience, and the fact that no one tries to confirm Marty's death despite access to live feeds of the teen's heartbeats, demonstrates an unbelievable level of negligence from the facility considering what's at stake, all for the sake of a third act twist. The release all button is a contrivance. I don't know what the utility would be of having a button that releases all the monsters into the facility, especially not in the same room as the door control, and it facilitates Dana and Marty's escape and the destruction of the facility. Anna Buckner getting back into a cube is a contrivance. Since Dana and Marty already used the Buckner elevator cube, I'm not exactly sure how she managed to get back into the facility, especially with the main staff all being pretty preoccupied with dying at that point in the story, which is significant again, considering that Anna Buckner's presence is instrumental to Marty's survival and the end of the world. So, for an objective score, I'm giving Cabin in the Woods a 5, but for my personal subjective enjoyment, I'm still giving this a 10. Would I recommend it? Yes, absolutely. It pains me to score a favourite of mine so low objectively, but subjectively, I still fucking love it and nothing's going to change that. This things happens, I guess. Anyway, tune in next time for Loki Episode 2.